Insurance, and we have three speakers, and thank you for being with us. Maxime Puteaux, you represent Nova Space. This is a consultancy firm specialized in space issues. Guillaume de Dinechin, you're head of Astria, and you're also a consultant. And I believe you have experience in space insurance. You were a former broker. And Edouard Merlet, you're in charge of airspace head of airspace at La Réunion Aérienne. So insurance is concerned about risk and vary over time. There's a talk about space overpopulation. You talk about space pollution with satellites all over the place, all over the space. So tell us about this overpopulation and the risk that entails. I believe, Maxime Puteaux, you have a little slideshow to tell us about the state of space. Well, this is an exciting time for the space industry. I mean, there are major upheavals in terms of magnitude. Never have we seen so many satellites up in space and so many launches, and then you have an industry with lots of uncertainty. We are at a crossroads. There's a technological disruption, and there's a market disruption. To give you an order of magnitude of the risk, we have about 2,000 satellites have been launched every year for the past 5 years. If you look at the number since 2015, the number has multiplied tenfold. The number of launches has been multiplied threefold. In looking at the statistics and forecasts, it looks as though we'll be launching in the next 10 years 10 satellites a year, but 8 tons worth of satellites per day. Of course, that creates a risk of traffic because physics being what it is, when you throw something up in space, it stays there. So imagine that on the Beltway you had cars with people behind the wheel, and then cars with no one behind the wheel because the driver left. And so that's the sort of situation we have going around the Earth. You have functional and non-functional satellites, and they have debris. And that, of course, that is a source of concern as well. I mean, we have risks and opportunities, of course, but there's an ecosystem developing. So that's what, I mean, the world is growing, but it's changing as well. Well, that's thank you for setting the stage. This is where we stand today. One of the main risks, as you pointed out, was lots of traffic. There's a bit of a traffic congestion. Is there a risk of collisions? Is that a real issue for space players? Guillaume, I'm turning to you. Is that a real issue? Is that a fantasy that satellites should collide with one another? Well, it's a paradox because it's a real issue in as much as, I mean, the risk has increased dramatically over the past few years. And that risk is not very much taken into account by insurers. I mean, you could well imagine exclusions in insurance policies for satellites in orbit to exclude damages from collisions, and that's not the case. Good news for the operators or for policyholders, but then there's the simple fact that it is very difficult to measure that risk because there has been no collisions so far in space. So there were one or two, but they were benign. No, not benign, but they were very exceptional. There's been no major claim related to a collision. So right now, the markets haven't responded. There's no exclusion, no increase in the premiums depending on the type of orbit. Although marginally a few insurers are taking that into account when they know you're dealing with orbits that are more likely to enter in collision because of low orbits is the case in point. Indeed, some insurers have been saying we will not accept a risk there. But again, it's very marginal indeed. So the short answer is, yeah, there is a risk. It has always been there, although it's never materialized, and for some reason, markets haven't been responding. Well, I would like to ask you, on the part of insurers, what would you say to that? Well, let me respond to what Maxime and Guillaume just said, the fact that the risk of collision on low orbit is not new for insurers. I mean, it was always identified, but I joined Guillaume in saying it's pretty difficult to measure this with any accuracy, the likelihood of a collision. I mean, you have some low orbits, satellites where the space is saturated, but you look at a map that is not to scale, so you're sometimes exaggerating the distances, but still. It shouldn't be underestimated. As Maxime said, there's more and more human activity, there are more and more launches, more and more constellations, and that brings about density on some orbits, some altitudes. And then if you look at the portfolio of space insurers, that has changed considerably. If you look at the makeup of a space insurer's portfolio 15 years ago compared to today, there's no comparison. I mean, the previous period, we were looking at geostationary satellites that are fixed orbit where the risk of a collision is almost nil. And then with the low orbit now being commercialized, you have that space being more saturated, taking more space in the portfolio of space insurers. Yeah, so you have more satellites out there, and they're not necessarily the same. I mean, you have the very big and expensive ones, and then you have smaller satellites that were built more quickly, not necessarily using the same materials. Has that trend increased the risk of material failure? I mean, you can imagine if you have a cheaper piece of equipment, it might break down more readily. Well, yes, and if you look at the philosophy of some players, they are out there they want to have a failure as quickly. I mean, fail fast, learn fast. Players who deliberately will take a risk simply because they can learn from that. They're prepared to bring the costs down to build launchers or satellites. And then, of course, these things are much less reliable than tested and proven technology on which there's more knowledge. Maxime, yes, well, you have technological choices, and you can have cheaper satellites, more of them, and so more redundancy, and that can be evened out by insurance. But you have new modes of operation. Starlink, of course, in 2018, learned how to process anti-collision alerts. And when a satellite was threatening an EU satellite, they didn't know whom to talk to. So they have to find new ways of managing risk. Now we are flying in the dark. I mean, you have telescopes, radars that can characterize the risk, but there's a margin of uncertainty for each satellite, so much so that 99% of anti-collision alerts saying this satellite is going to come across another one turn out to be false positives because, I mean, in the end, we don't have the collision, but of course you have less uncertainty and have areas more densely fitted with flying objects. But data is not always easy to retrieve. I mean, sometimes you may have a satellite out there, it's filled, but you can't send a mechanic to fix it. I mean, this is not a car stranded on the road. So is that a challenge as well, to retrieve data, making sure that it's reliable? I mean, Guillaume, surely that must be a challenge for insurers.
For insurers, space insurance is a bit specific in that a satellite is covered for its performance, whatever the mode of failure. It doesn't matter, it's covered. So we're going to calculate, we're going to determine the satellite's operations and will determine a loss formula that will determine the loss to pay for in case of failure. And that, of course, that should be fairly easy to get the data that will help characterize the satellite's operations and performance, because that's precisely the purpose of the satellite. To answer your question, in general, there aren't too many problems in retrieving data to help characterize how a satellite works. However, then, there are issues in determining the cause of the failure and deciding whether it would be covered by an exclusion or not. Or maybe determining whether there would be remedies that could be applied to the satellite to reduce the amount of the loss. And there, sometimes it's a bit difficult to get the data. In some cases, we would be very happy if it's a mechanical failure, a solar panel that fails to deploy, or an antenna that fails to deploy, because we might get pictures to see exactly the position of the solar panel or the antenna. That can happen, but it's very rare to get that. In general, we do get the necessary data, and in some circumstances, we should get a bit more, but there I'll refer back to the insurer. Yes, I'll echo what you've just said. Our job in insurance is based on information and information quality at the time of underwriting and at the time of the loss. And so, as you said, it's very difficult to get an adjuster up in space in case of a failure. But the assessment is made by the team, and the specific notion that we get the operation from the policyholder, from the operator itself. Now, there are missions that are launched to extend the lifespan of some satellites, to place them on different orbits, or missions to repair or observe satellites. Is that going to open up the door to a full range of applications to help reduce losses or launch corrective measures? Only time will tell, but some players are working on that seriously. Things are happening there. Then, when we prepared this discussion, Guillaume, you opened up a perspective that I didn't have in mind. You said that we don't always talk about the impact of getting erroneous data from a spacecraft, sending, for instance, your GPS navigation system says stupid things, and then your driver goes off a cliff or somewhere. How can you investigate that? Is it possible? That's a horribly difficult question, because it's about product liability on the one hand, and it's intermingled with international conventions that regulate damage caused by a spacecraft. There's a 1972 convention signed by most countries operating in space, making the launch state indefinitely liable for any and all damage on land and in space, with absolute liability for land, Earth liability, and liability for fault in space. And so if there is such an event happening, it's going to be difficult to determine. As far as I know, there's never any claim that was decided by these conventions. It has to go through diplomatic routes. It would be very difficult. Those operators that relay GPS-type data, for instance, via satellite, get TPL, the third-party liability insurance, to cover that type of damage. Would it be necessary to strengthen the regulatory framework to make it all tighter? Should there be harmonization even at state level in order to avoid these dilemmas sometimes? Maxime, what do you think? Being a legal expert by training, if I look at that with my legal hat on, there are two contradictory. There are the legal highest bidders that tend to protect or overprotect, and on the other hand, there are the lowest bidders that will try to attract industry by having a favorably business-friendly setup. states being in charge of their own national activities, they have their own national regulations. There are EU rules, there are US rules given their activity, and so the rest of the world is inspired by that. And so it's like a tug of war in the space industry. And given all the efforts made by the previous administration in the US in terms of liability, above a certain altitude, you would need to have thrust to maneuver or deorbit. Otherwise, you'll be considered as debris. It was received fairly coolly by the industry, trying to minimize costs, so to have spacecraft as light as possible, so not to add any weight. That would be the thrust systems. And we're dealing with orders of magnitude in terms of numbers that were never seen before, and also risk concentration. That's what I showed on my photo earlier. You have a handful of players that will launch 70 to 80% of satellites in number. In value, it's going to be smaller. So this risk concentration, for the first time, might lead to an avoidance of liability. And given the tragedy of the commons that we're facing now, that's threatening the very durability and sustainability of that business. If OneWeb and Starlink create debris because of their spacecraft, that would jeopardize the business itself. So there's some hope from industry, maybe via insurance, that something will be done. The cost of inaction would be higher than the cost of action. Buying information to reduce the degree of uncertainty that you would have space garbage trucks, in a way, to collect spacecraft and deorbit them. That would make space activities last longer, and that would make the business more sustainable. Maxime, well, in space, there are no rules of the road. So we need a regulatory framework, and at present, the owner of a satellite that has a potential collision alarm with another spacecraft can choose to maneuver or not. And it's the same thing for the owner of debris, a bit of launch vehicle, an upper stage, or passive or active debris, to say, don't touch my spacecraft. Although they can technically operate some maneuvers, they may choose not to, and that is a loophole that needs to be solved by the space countries. Now, risk, the defense risk, is that also getting bigger in insurance contracts? Still talking to you, Edouard. For our damage policies, we exclude war risk and anything related to attacks or sabotage. But of course, we know that with geopolitical tensions right now, this is creating also some space-based initiatives. And at present, we haven't been faced directly with a situation that would lead us to lift or use an exclusion for insurers. We would come back to the previously mentioned notion of access to information. How can we be sure that it's really an attack? Has it been claimed by someone else? We can see all the difficulties around that. A quick word about the environmental dimension. Indeed, we can see a multiplication of satellites as insurers and space insurance experts. Is that also something that is becoming bigger and bigger, you think? Your clients want to be virtuous, and well, those that do get insurance, of course, the others do whatever they want. But are you also trying to raise awareness? Edouard, maybe, but Maxime or Guillaume? Individually, as space insurance players, as an insurer, when we talk with our clients and when we get information about a mission, about their project, once the mission is over, is there a thrust system to deorbit the satellite? What measures will be adopted? This is how we can influence. This is going to become heightened if there's a market consensus, which may not be the case necessarily now. Everyone's doing what they want for themselves. The environmental aspects, it's true that, well, I think it's interesting when we see the aviation or aeronautics business being castigated for their 2 or 3% of global emissions. When you see aircraft, you immediately think that they pollute. If you see rockets, you see a lot of smoke, you may think that they pollute, but it's very complex when it comes to the environmental impact of the space industry. Of course, it will depend on the technology and the thrust systems that are used. It's not the same if you use solid thrust or a cryogenic engine in terms of environmental impact, but you would need to look at the entire supply chain for fuel production and storage. It's a very complex image, but as an insurer, we can also decide to cover some missions that will be made in space. Our choice is, for instance, not to insure space tourism missions. We're not aligned on this new development when it comes to missions. I personally and professionally believe that space is necessary for all the benefits that we know about in terms of telecommunications, Earth observation, and science, but we're not so aligned on space tourism, for instance. These are positions that will be made individually on the market, maybe with the need for a market consensus to emerge. You wanted to respond. We've never talked so much about space in the last few years, and it's good because that gives visibility to the business. But the flip side is that we're also exposed naturally to criticism. There's a real challenge for the industry to stand apart and separate between really useful activities. Climate change monitoring is accessible via space and telecoms activities, but then there's a lot of acceptance challenges, the rejection of space tourism. Katy Perry and Jeff Bezos' girlfriend cavorting in space, so that's really necessary, and we'll need to, justify ourselves right now. In bids, we're asking people to prove their bona fide reasons for launching, and we'll need to convince people that space is useful for the Earth, but we'll need to distinguish between invisible pollution and real pollution. A launch is spectacular. It's the most fascinating part and the least profitable part of the industry, but it's not necessarily what pollutes the most. It's all that's happening before that that generates pollution. And we'll need to educate a lot, otherwise we might end up with protests and demonstrations and head-on opposition to our activities. Something I'd like you to respond to. Well, in my mind, when it comes to new challenges to space insurance, I was thinking about new risks, but then you're saying that there are some players that are not insured, and that's also a challenge for insurers when it comes to survival. Do you agree with that? I imagine. Guillaume, I could see you nod. Maxime as well. Guillaume, please. This is a very peculiar market in that there are very few events that are covered. When you insure a fleet of cars, when you do car insurance, there are millions of cars on the road, so you can build statistics and you're able to model the premiums and the risks and all that. In space insurance, on the good years, there are about 15 launches, and so the law of large sets does not apply. So you're constantly analyzing a risk for what it is. What is the inherent risk? And you look at the spacecraft's configuration to see whether there's a risk for breakdowns. So what are the redundancies and the margins of error? For launch vehicles, there's a phenomenon that's entirely new. Falcon 9 launching 200 times a year, whereas in the past we were used to having, well, there you can build statistics, but that's still 200 times a year only. And the way the industry is evolving is that the number of big satellites that accounts for, they have a price tag of $300 or $400 million individually. This number of spacecraft is going down, being replaced by smaller spacecraft launched in greater numbers, And there, the operator, the owner of the satellite thinks, given the price of my spacecraft, a few million euros, I'll need 10, I'll launch 12, and I won't get insurance for that. Whereas in the past, it was impossible to do that with a big $450 million spacecraft that is in a single orbital location. Of course, the cost is not the same, especially if you've got fairly deep pockets and you can absorb the ground damage. Maxime, should we expect to see some concentration on the space insurance market? Some might disappear. It's no secret that some insurance players have left the market because they wouldn't be able to survive there. However, the pie of the space business is getting bigger. Well, space insurance is not growing in proportion to that, but we can insure new businesses and new segments, because when a moon lander is going to the moon, maybe its thrust is similar to what another spacecraft could use with the same technology around the Earth, and so we could have growth opportunities with diversification marginally. I agree with what Guillaume said. The old world no longer exists, focused on a handful of big objects with fairly low risk, premiums that were rarely used, and here we're going to fight for smaller opportunities that are in greater numbers but more fragmented. Edouard Merlet at La Réunion Aérienne, you're a broker, you're in the front seat. You might think that you need to change with diversification or repositioning. As an insurer, we're an intermediary, but we represent insurers, and it's true that we're now doing space insurance differently from what we were doing 15 or 20 years ago. We have to adapt our practices, adapt our wordings, the way we're going to insure a spacecraft from new space. You don't have to insure a spacecraft for launch plus 1 year, or just launch plus first signal received, or to a total loss. So we're adapting our covers. We don't do them the same way. And even though there's volatility, because volatility is inherent to the space insurance market, you can see that the portfolio is changing. Geostationary risk is stabilizing now, with a bit more risk in low Earth orbit. And in this low Earth orbit, LEO, you've got more spacecraft, such as us, also with Earth observation satellites. There was a dip in 2024, 2025, but prospects are encouraging for 26 and 27 about a recovery, or at least a transfer of risk from space industry players to the insurance market. Since this is almost the end of this session, if you could select one word or adjective to qualify the future of space insurance: fragmented, reinforced, adapting. Guillaume? It's still exciting. How else could I say that? Just one caveat in order to characterize the volatility of space insurance. Probably 80% of the capacity is brought by MGAs. These aren't big insurers that will put a lot of money on the table. These are small members that will provide small sums collectively. So that provides a lot of volatility in capacity, and that's specific. It's in the world of insurance. Coming back to characteristics: exciting, probably very uncertain, and of course highly connected to developments in the space sector. Edouard, I would say resilient. We know that there are crises in insurance. There were crises in other markets. It's not specific to space insurance. There is volatility, but we know how to manage it, provided that the market is able to respond and become aware of the risks we're facing. But I'm confident about the resilience of the space insurance market. Exciting and resilient. Well, we can give you a big hand for this session. Thank you. And now I will give the floor to